Hello, this is the Using Sources video for Miss G's Comp 2 classes. In this video, I'll talk about Chapter 20, called Using Sources and Everything's an Argument, as well as the annoying sources reading that's found in the Before Class Materials folder. You should have read both of those sections before watching this video. I'll also talk about the reading journal that is based on those readings and look at how these readings connect with the readings for the rest of the week. As you're doing your work this week, I want you to keep in mind that all of it will be on a test at the end of week 4. This test is called Using Sources Quiz 1, and it will be due on February 7th at midnight. That's a Sunday. And again, that will be over the material that we are discussing this week in week 3. So I've broken the ideas of using sources down into 3 lessons. And the first is synthesizing and integrating, what we're talking about in this video and in the reading you guys did beforehand. The second part, which we'll do in class this week, is the punctuation side and the sort of the small details that we want to make sure we get right so not to distract our readers. And then the third part, which will be after class this week, is over the MLA guidelines. So synthesizing sources is probably one of the most difficult parts of doing research and writing about what you read, because it really requires us to do a lot of thinking about what we're reading, and that's what's going to translate into what we write about. So while it's the most difficult part, the more we do it and the more thoroughly we do it, the easier it will make the writing process when we get to that part. So what is synthesis of sources? That means we are figuring out what the ideas are from each of our sources and matching those up with our own ideas and figuring out how they work together in new ways. For Essay 1, we're not going to be really working with multiple sources, but you are going to be needing to synthesize the parts of the essay you're looking at or the article you're looking at along with what you're reading about what argument should do, and putting those together. If an argument is supposed to do X, Y, Z, is the source doing X, Y, Z as well? So that's what you're going to synthesize in this paper, but looking towards future papers, you will be using multiple sources. So a lot of what we're talking about in this video will apply more accurately to future papers. So the great thing about this chapter in Everything's an Argument is it gives us a lot of strategies for gathering ideas from sources, or practicing infotension, which is a definition given on page 465. So, and I also appreciate that this book is pretty modern. It's brand new, and so it recognizes that idea that the way we do that is so much more different now in modern times than, say, when I was going to college as an undergrad. So we want to make sure we're using those new tools to the optimum. Okay, so when we synthesize, we really want, again, start thinking about what those ideas are, and pages 466 through 469 give lots of questions we can ask ourselves and strategies that we can practice. So I really encourage you guys to do this for every source we use all semester, because the more you're synthesizing while you're doing your research, while you're reading your sources, like I said earlier, the more ideas you'll have later when you're actually doing the writing. So as you're marking up your sources, some things you might want to mark in terms of how you're going to use it are listed briefly on page 467, and then in more detail on pages 476 through 480. And there are different reasons we might want to bring in a source. And again, a lot of this is going to apply to more so to later papers, but we will use a lot of these concepts in essay number 1. So the first two have to do with, is there something that our readers need to know, or if they need background on what else has already been said about that topic, or is there something that they, like in terms of history or something that they need to know before they can understand your own. The next two kind of go together as well in terms of just, again, still thinking about our readers' needs and what kind of things are they going to need to know to make sure your argument works. And then the last two are probably the bulk of where you're going to bring in sources in your paper. So, and that's bringing in evidence to support your reasons. And also, as we know, a good argument will always look at the counter argument. So that's one of the biggest pieces of an academic argument, right, is to make sure to make sure to let our readers know that we have looked at that and we're still correct in our own argument. So sometimes we'll bring in evidence to show what those are. So the first section of this chapter is all about taking the ideas of our sources and thinking about what they are and how we want to use them. And the second part of the chapter is about actually putting them in our paper in the form of integration. So actually putting their words in with ours. And there are different ways that we can do that. And you should definitely familiarize yourself with those three different ways. So paraphrasing and summarizing is where we put the source into our own words in different ways. One is more general, one is more condensed. And then of course quoting, which is what we're going to be practicing with the rest of this lesson. So when we quote, there are two good ways that I want you guys to learn to do that, how to do so. And the first way is called blending. And that's where we take part of the source, the sentence itself, and put it into a sentence that is partially our own. And I'll look at some examples of these here in a moment. The second way is to use signal phrases. And there are lists in both of the books. And this is where we use a tag or a verb to explain our material. And again, I'll look at some examples here in a moment. The TICA ×2 paragraph template can be found in the Before Class Materials folder with this video, and I'll also look at that. And that's a way to set up a paragraph with our own sentences as well as sentences that use either blending or signaling. So let's take a look at those three things right now. So part one of the reading journal, based on this video and the readings, asks you to blend some quotes into a sentence. So that's coming back to this idea of fitting quoted phrases or sentences smoothly into our own language and sentences. And there's more directions there on the journal. So here's an example. Here's a quote, and I want to blend that into a sentence, okay? And this is a different way of quoting than signaling. So blending, here's an example of a sentence that I've blended with my words and the author's words. So even though times may be difficult, it is important to be positive and love the light, for it shows me the way while enduring the darkness, because it shows me the stars. So as you can tell from the quotation marks, those are someone else's words. We're going to talk more about punctuation in class this week. And then the words that are mine are not in quotation marks. If you listen to me read it, you can't really tell where my words are and where the author's words are. It blends, right, from one to the other. It is grammatical. So that's the thing that we want to think about when we're blending is how can I just keep my prose smooth? And this helps, it helps our reader understand it more and doesn't take them out of the paper as we're trying to make our own arguments. So there's a few technical things I also want to point out in this sentence. I did use brackets here and here, and those were for clarity. That's something else we're going to talk about with punctuation on Wednesday, or sorry, in class this week. The other thing I want to look at is that I didn't use all of the source or all of the quote, and that's okay, again, as long as it's grammatical and smooth and blended. So coming back to the second way of using sources in our paper, and that's of signal phrases. So going back to this again, the signal phrases where we have a list of verbs that the reading journal asks you to basically do the same thing as you did for part one, but use signal phrases instead of blending. So in my example, I've used the same quote. You guys will be using different quotes, but I'm using the same quote from before, but this time I have used a signal phrase. And so I've used a verb, oops, and the person's name, the author's name, and it sort of just sets it off. That's why it's called a signal phrase. It's signaling to the author, to your reader that you're about to give a quote. And because if you look at those charts on the pages in the books, we'll use different verbs to give different meanings. So of course, saying someone declares versus someone argues has different connotations. So we want to make sure, these are a little bit easier in terms of just plugging them in, but we do want to make sure we don't do so blindly and that we pick good verbs that work with what we're trying to do. So I'm here actually in Blackboard now looking at the journal. When I looked at my PowerPoint, the first part is asking you to blend your sentences or blend these quotes into your own sentences, right? So how I did in that first example, where it flows from my words to theirs, or it can go back and forth, or start with their words and end with yours. But the sentences should be partly yours and partly theirs. For this part, I don't want you to use signal phrases, right? That's what you're going to be doing for part 2. And that's the one where we use the verb, the signal phrase. And there are examples of those in both books. Just above the journal is that Tika ×2 template that I mentioned earlier. And like I said, this is a template for how we could build a paragraph. It's kind of like training wheels. So if you're thinking about putting together paragraphs for the first time using sources, that can help you, but it can get a little formulaic if you depend on it too much. So basically you start with your topic sentence, that's what the letters stand for. You introduce the quote, and that's through blending or signaling. You list the quote, and then you analyze the quote. So explain to your reader why you're using it. And then usually you would do that twice in a paragraph. Okay, so you're fully explaining a point using about 2 pieces of evidence. The second page of this document gives an example of a Tika ×2 paragraph. So here's a paragraph using a source, Dr. Seuss. And in the first time it quotes, so here's the integrating, he says, okay, so that's a signal phrase. And then the quote is listed, and then the A and the A are analyzing or telling the reader why you're using that source. And again, remember, that's where that part's going to come from your synthesis, the analysis that you've done as you're doing your research. Why is that important to your argument? Okay, and then transitioning to the second piece of evidence. And this one, Seuss warns. So again, we have a signal phrase setting up the quote, followed by analysis, and then a clincher or finishing up the paragraph. So I've talked about 2 ways of using sources in your paper, and you're going to practice both of those ways in the reading journal. I've given you a resource that you can use when you're drafting to help you with fitting those blending and signalings into your own work, into your own argument. But I do want to talk briefly about some ways that we want to avoid when we're using our sources. So there are 2 ways that are mentioned in the readings, and the first one is from Everything's an an Argument, and it talks about that's something we don't want to do, and that's explained in the book, and part of the journal is asking you to define that, so I just stumbled because I was about to give that away. And then the other reading, Annoying Ways People Use Sources, is completely about things not to do, and I really urge you guys to pay attention to what those different kinds are, because I will be looking at your papers to make sure you're not doing them. And some of those are like dumping sources. I think it's called Armadillo Roadkill in the reading, and it's actually, I think, very humorous and a good way to remember those things that we're not supposed to do when we use our sources. And this is all about making it clear for our reader, making it so that they understand what we're using and why we're using it, and getting on with our argument. So again, back here on Blackboard, part 4 asks you to talk about what patch writing is and compare it to what synthesis is. I've talked a lot about synthesis in this video, and of course it's all defined in the chapter. And then part 3 asks you to think about all of those different ways that are listed in that other reading, and think about one that you've noticed, maybe going back, that's something I used to do, or hopefully we won't keep doing it. Give an example of a time you've done one of those things. And then give me an example of one that you've seen out in the wild, so to speak. So seeing it somewhere that annoys you yourself, not taken from the reading Annoying Ways. And then for part 3, just tell how to fix it, how to fix one of those. And that's also explained in the Annoying Ways article. So like I mentioned earlier, we have 2 more segments to this idea of using sources this week. We're going to do punctuation work in class, and then we're going to work on MLA for your after class stuff. So keep working on using sources, and I know you guys are doing a great job. Let me know if you have any questions.